thanks very much for joining us. What we were hoping to do today is talk to a couple of people who are in the sort of the thick of working in the cloud or transitioning to the cloud. And before we kick off, I'd like to take the opportunity to ask both the people who are with me. I'm Rupert Watson from Jigsaw 24, and I'm here to sort of ask questions and sort of, I guess, moderate the debate. And on my right or left, depending on which way you look, I've got Claire Feeney from All3 Media International. Claire, would you mind kind of explaining who you are and what you do?
Yeah, hi, I'm Claire Feeney, All3 Media International. I'm head of technical operations. So just for anybody who's not sure, All3 Media International are the distribution arm of the All3 Media Group, who have multiple production companies in the UK, across the globe. And the international part takes those international distribution rights, sells them, and monetizes all of that content.
Thank you. And Dan, would you introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, I'm Dan Carey-Jones. I work for Arrow International Media, and I help them out on the post-production side generally, but over the years that's sort of spread into general sort of technology support and advice, anything with a plug on it, basically. I try and help out with.
Although I guess you're busily chopping the plugs off at the moment.
Oh, to a certain extent, yeah.
How things are going. So what we were hoping to cover in this discussion, and we've got till 11:30, so it's going to be fairly truncated, I suspect. So I'll try not to waffle myself. But obviously Claire's on the kind of distribution side of the business, and Dan obviously is busy with making the program. So we're kind of covering the kind of soup to nuts. So we're not obviously going to touch on acquisition and the cloud. I think we're probably a little bit far away from actually shooting data into the cloud, but we're certainly right on the cusp of editing in the cloud. And I think Dan has got some observations about that, because I think he's been recently testing what and how it's possible to do that. And obviously Claire, I think, has been working with the cloud for some period of time. In fact, why don't we start at the end, Claire? Do you want to just explain how have you guys, has COVID been the start of your journey into the cloud, or have you guys been leveraging it already and kind of feeling justified in your choices on the back of the current events?
Yeah, absolutely. So we moved all of our assets into the cloud. Well, we actually completed that move in the summer of last year. It actually took around 18 months to get all of the content from where it was stored up into the cloud. And that is purely because of the volume. We were running 24/7. We're like swans, frantically.
So where did you have it stored before? Where was it stored when it was on premise? Was it in a big kind of disk array or?
Yeah, absolutely. It was with our vendor, who had been with for 10 years or so. So they had all of our content. And actually, the decision to move the content from the vendor into our own cloud environment came out of a disaster recovery session that we had about 5 years ago. Got consultants in, and they said, so what's your disaster recovery policy for, your assets, blowing up? And we're like, we don't have one. Yeah, exactly. So our disaster recovery policy was actually our vendors, and we had no control over that. And of course, when you talk about disaster recovery, it's always a bomb going off or cyber attacks. Nobody considered coronavirus.
Not getting to the office generally, yes.
Absolutely, yeah. It was all much bigger, much more, more terrifying, because it was more visual of why we couldn't do our jobs as usual. Yeah.
So you've now got all of your your distribution assets in the cloud, and you access them, distribute them, everything from the cloud provider, and you've got an asset management system that allows you to access it.
Yeah, that's right. So a couple of things happened simultaneously. The group was growing rapidly, and we were all trying to catch up. All3 Media International opened offices in Singapore and New York. And of course, we were used to having a central London office. Everybody's in there. Everybody can access all those local drives. The guys in New York and Singapore couldn't access anything. So we had to come up with some solutions. We put some temporary stopgaps in, but actually the cloud and the asset management system accessible from wherever you are was, that also came out of that sort of global expansion.
Interesting. So, Dan, what about you? Obviously, you're at the post-production end of things. I mean, I know recently you've done some fairly comprehensive testing as to whether or not it's kind of ready for prime time. I mean, is it? What do you see the kind of the opportunity being in terms of cloud editing versus on-premise editing, or taking it all home to the editor's kitchen or wherever?
I kind of think that ultimately it's going to be for a fairly long period of time. I can see it being a hybrid sort of situation where perhaps people are in for 1 or 2 days a week in the edit suite at Arrow or at the post-production house or wherever, just to bring in that sort of physical connection with the producer, director, edit producer, however. But the majority of the time, I can see them quite readily working from home. And during the COVID period, we've been using RGS largely, HP RGS to connect in. Not strictly speaking a cloud, I suppose, but it's connected. It's not.
So they're connecting from a remote location back into your office.
Back into our servers, yeah. And what we found with to be fair to them, with Avid's Edit on Demand appears to work without any significant downside. And the primary point really, when COVID hit and we started doing all of this remote sort of editing, the main thing was to try and make the minimal change to the editor's life as possible. Obviously, there are going to be some. We had to supply big wide monitors for them rather than the 2 little ones, and there are minor changes like that to make the workflow work a little bit better. But ultimately, the interaction needed to be as they would expect if they came into Arrow. Otherwise, it wasn't going to take off, and they weren't going to back it. And that worked.
And in terms of the way it works, I mean, who's happier, the producer or the editor, or the director or the editor?
I think the editor.
Right. So they're editing at home in their pants, so they're delighted. The producers and the directors, presumably, are they finding it a good experience or not? Do you think, how do you envisage that working? Because obviously they're presumably working remotely, so you've got the editor in one place and the producer and the director potentially in another place. How do you kind of?
Well, they're able to collaborate. You can both join into the same machine. And it's the same with Edit on Demand. They can collaborate and connect up. And I think the production teams themselves, I think, found the sort of isolation aspect of it more of an obstruction perhaps than the editor, because editors.
They've always been solitary beasts.
They're fairly solitary beasts, and I can't vouch for what they're wearing below their waistline, but I never see below the desk. But I think that there is a benefit in having that face-to-face exchange, and we've all done it for months. We've had the Zoom calls and the Teams calls and what have you, and it's great. But it's never quite the same as.
It's not quite the same as having a director slapping the desk next to you when they want the outpoint to happen. Absolutely.
I think that happens. That's why I think that the hybrid sort of solution is the way that we're probably going to follow forward. On the contrary to that, of course, is that from Arrow's perspective, we have 13 edit suites, and once those edit suites were full, we couldn't fit anything else in. Now, of course, even if they come in 1 or 2 days a week, it's effectively doubled the capacity that we can deal with in-house. So it's
interesting. And it's really intriguing to me that, as Claire mentioned, you've got this international aspect where previously, you had a very specific geographic location, which was where your kit was ultimately, and therefore you had to be where you could access the data. What I think has been fascinating for me is talking to a number of our customers who, and to be candid, we've been trying to promote this kind of remote workflow for about 4 or 5 years with modest success, it has to be admitted. And then obviously this all came along and everyone couldn't kind of do it fast enough. But I think what's happened is kind of, in retrospect, a number of the customers we talked to have kind of looked at their businesses and said, what on earth were we thinking? We were so geographically specific, based in Soho, for example, or central London or whatever, and effectively denying ourselves access to a customer base across the entire country. I mean, what was that about, kind of thing? I mean, do you see, obviously you've both got international in your title. I mean, does the kind of the increased use of the cloud as both a kind of place to keep data and a place to kind of operate on data, does that presage a new kind of reduction in geographical boundaries? Do you see the businesses potentially expanding across and out into other areas? I mean, certainly we've seen a bit of that already. Well, sorry, Claire, what do you feel about that? Do you think that's going to be a catalyst, or is it just an enabler for doing the job as it's currently done and it'll stay pretty much as is?
I think certainly with all three media internet. Oh, you hear me now?
That's it. We can hear you. Yep.
I think with all three media international, certainly we're looking more at a better work-life balance. So, everybody being in the office in Covent Garden, 9 till 5, 5 days a week. So it was a slightly different approach, maybe not so much about how to broaden business or create new business, but just making business or doing business slightly nicer.
Right. Interesting. And what about you, Dan? I mean, do you see, you're going to hire editors in Northern France kind of coming soon? Or
yeah, we already have. We've
okay.
used editors that were in Belgium, and another editor, I think, was in the Netherlands. And from a production perspective, we've always been fairly international anyway. Quite often we shoot drama in South Africa or Canada.
And do you see the possibility of, obviously having your editorial capability in the cloud as beneficial in that respect, so that you can start putting stuff together in, hotel rooms in South Africa while you're shooting, putting sequences together to see if you've got, everything you needed, or is that not quite kind of on the sort of to-do list at this point?
I'm not sure that's quite on the to-do list, for the simple reason that it's fairly fundamentally changing the sort of the structure of the workday, if you do. I mean, it's sort of
right.
It's demanding extra for certain people, or different work from certain people and different work from other people.
Right.
I think that's a bit of a longer process to get integrated into those sort of systems.
And that's a good point. I mean, just to both of you on that one, how tricky has it been because obviously people are the expensive bit in most of these kind of interactions, and they're often the bit that, the change management, the kind of retraining, the reacclimatization. I mean, how much of a change is it? Does it kind of seamlessly fit into people's workflow, do you think, or is there going to be an element of acclimatization and getting people to kind of come on board with how working with the cloud is versus kind of working with on-premise stuff?
From our point of view, I mean, it was the circumstances dictated the need, to be perfectly honest. So people have had 3 months of total lockdown and another 3 months of partial lockdown, and during that total lockdown they actually realized that things could be done, and I think that made it certainly accelerated the adoption of things that probably wouldn't have been adopted in the sort of time period they've been adopted. It's almost
interesting. And how about you, Claire? I mean, are you finding it? Do people enjoy are they kind of, wow, this is so much better than it used to be, but we weren't expecting it to be? What's the general consensus?
Yeah, everybody is pretty much blown away. I mean, our asset management system really did come into its own in March when we were all sent home. We have been using in September.
You got a phone call from Netflix asking if you've got lots more content they can have, did you?
Well, absolutely. I mean, not only people who buy content from us, producers, were coming to us saying, we can't get in the office to get hold of that drive that I've got in my bottom drawer because we want to recut a look back or a best of. Channel 4 have said we've got an hour. Yeah, absolutely. And the channels need to fill slots, and reaching out to broadcasters, what can you hash together? To producers, what can you hash together? And quite a few of our in-house production companies were coming to us saying, we can't get hold of our content. Do you have it? And the worst case scenario, it was taking us 12 hours to get a bunch of content over to their remote editors. So kind of those were the unforeseen benefits of what we'd already done.
In terms of security, there's a question from Paul Craig saying, you'd like to hear about security issues when using contractors. So presumably, Dan, what about you? You got any concerns about people in northern France in their underpants looking at unbroadcast footage that they could be happily showing to their children?
We have to rely on them to create the appropriate environment. We ask for sort of some confirmations of that when we're engaging them. In terms of the actual security of access, that it is pretty doubled down with security. It's the all of these systems are effectively, well, we say it's security bulletproof, but in fact,
for now. No. I think the Russians would concur. But the obviously the fact that it's in Azure or Amazon or Google Cloud or wherever it is that it's repository, clearly the level of security and kind of professionalism surrounding that is pretty high. But clearly, at the point of consumption, if you've got an editor who's running OBS on the same machine as the editing he's doing, which you may or may not have control over, presumably that is a risk and not one that you can mitigate with tech. It's one you have to mitigate with kind of human interaction and contracts, I presume.
No. And also, the people are working from home; they're not playing from home. So it's sort of expected that there is an appropriate work environment. We obviously take all the precautions to make sure that they're supplied with anything that they require in order to fulfil that. But there's a certain amount of trust involved.
Although presumably, I don't know, you're primarily documentaries, aren't you? Your kind of stuff. So generally speaking, I guess it's not quite as sort of paranoid as kind of first release kind of stuff, drama, which I presume. I mean, we've certainly got a number of customers who do fingerprinting and watermarking in their content, and I presume it's possible to do that with your rushes and to identify the source of the leak. And I guess that's a preventative measure. What about you, Claire? Do you have concerns over security, or is your stuff all you're happy people will watch it wherever they were?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the asset management system and AWS, they're all sort of configured to the highest industry security standards, I'm told. Certainly when we get rushes or rough cuts in of a new drama with heavy investment attached to it, we're quite, conscious of leaking that, sharing it with people. And actually, in the old days, we would be sent a link, could be, can't download it, only that person can watch it. It actually makes it quite difficult. If the big boss gets the link, but other people need to view it as well.
Yes, like sharing OneDrive.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, with the new system, with our asset management system, someone can send us the content, we can upload it to the cloud. If we need to share it with people, we can do a transcode to a proxy with bespoke watermarking, so it will have your name on it. So if it does end up on YouTube or somewhere, we know exactly where it's come from. When we were much more offline, the sharing of sensitive content was very
pinch a hard drive
because everybody is
so actually
everybody is so paranoid.
You've got the kind of the access controls that come with cloud access, so you can give individual links to people, you can prevent it being downloaded. I think you're right, the back end technology does prevent a lot more. In fact, so the inevitable question has occurred, I'm afraid. So it's time to talk about egress, which is the kind of the ghost in the machine, I think, for everybody. I mean, Claire, to you, obviously you're busy playing video out of the cloud. You must be generating egress costs. How comparative to being on premise, what are you looking at in terms of ongoing costs for sending videos to people to watch?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing with the distribution business is if we are taking video from Amazon, from AWS, and putting it through some sort of software transcoding, it's because we've sold it. So there's a license fee attached to it. Often the buyer has paid for the asset. So yes, there are costs, but they're commercially by our business.
Yeah, you don't sell stuff unless it pays more than the egress is going to cost you, possibly even more.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about you, Dan? Obviously, you've not necessarily sold it yet. You're generating an awful lot of egress when you're playing back video out of kind of whatever editorial environment you choose. Is that built into the model, or does it make it more expensive, or does the chip cost just kind of change to somewhere else?
Well, to be honest, for things that are actually cloud-based editing, if you like, then it's sort of built into the cost that you're paying anyway. So you'll pay, however much per month or per week for your suite, and the egress is included in all of that. Right. On the other side of things, we've seen our long-term archive, if you like Claire was pointing out about the disaster recovery process. Well, a disaster recovery copy of our rushes resides in Azure or Amazon, or it's Azure in our case. But and we have seen over originally that copy is there in case the building burns down. It's not supposed to be used at all, and so we weren't expecting massive egress charges. But now that COVID has hit, it's the best and the easiest way of people accessing the huge library of footage that we've got, right, and also introducing other services into the mix. So
right, that you wouldn't necessarily have necessarily chosen to do. But exactly. I think the punchline, from both of you, is saying that if you've got a commercial reason to access it, you're delighted that it's universally accessible, and that egress is a cost, but it's one that you kind of factor into your business.
It's a cost of doing business, really.
Interesting. So I think we've touched on it, but I think probably Leo's asking about whether there are opportunities for going global. I think we've probably touched on that, haven't we, with the international question? I think the opportunity is there, and I presume, Claire, you're back in the day when you went to MIP or wherever, you've got access to everything globally. But does it? And I suppose you were saying you've got colleagues in Singapore and wherever that to some extent, because AWS is ubiquitous. You can access it wherever you want. I presume you don't do geo distribution. Your data is in one data center in, I don't know, Amsterdam or wherever it might be, or London. You don't kind of you don't replicate it around the world to reduce latency and all that kind of good fun, which obviously one could do if one was inclined to.
Yeah, to be honest, no. But our group technology department handle all considerations to do with the cloud, because we don't just have our content in there. There's other sort of business systems that are set up there. So yeah, I mean, we don't have control over that.
Interesting. So do you see going forwards with your businesses? Do you question to both of you? Start with you, Dan. Do you see the cloud being more important? If COVID were to go away tomorrow, would you go back to how you used to be and kind of it would all be a fever dream, or do you think you've kind of identified opportunities that you're going to continue to capitalize on, whatever?
I mean, to be fair, as a company, we're fairly sort of cloud centric anyway, because we had we'd put our archive in the cloud. We've got a viewing MAM system that's all residing in Amazon. We've got all of the offices are run on Office 365. So we were sort of going down that route anyway. It was been when Johnny and Tom founded the company, I remember sort of sketching out a remote editing plan on the back of a fag packet, essentially.
All the best plans are written on there.
Yeah, exactly. And 10 years later, we're almost nearly there. And it's getting to the stage now that we had hoped for 9 to 10 years ago. And as I think it's somebody's mentioned, is that why would you go backwards now?
Yeah, and I guess, Claire, the same for you. You sound like you're kind of fully on board. There's no turning back. And is there anything in your current business that you would now move into the cloud as well, or is that it? I mean, there's nothing else to kind of get off premise. You can work from anywhere. And it sounded like what you're saying earlier about not all kind of piling into the same office. You can operate from anywhere and presumably engage and employ anyone, wherever they happen to be. The whole kind of geographical constraint and so on is no longer a factor in the business. Do you think that will? I mean, will that release? Does that have a commercial benefit? Do you think? Is the bottom line going to be better off or worse off as a consequence of using the cloud? Obviously, the costs move around. In general, do we make more money or less money on the back of where you guys are?
I think it depends on how you make money. To be honest, with Arrow's a production company, and all of these tools are to facilitate production and to make production hopefully more efficient. and to improve the end product effectively. And all of these technologies, if it was going to be quicker and better to cut it on a steam back, then we'd cut it on a steam back.
Sure.
So using whichever tool is going to make it more effective at the end or more efficient at the end.
But as a general rule, is the production manager looking more or less worried about their budget? If the cloud is the future, does that mean the budgets need to increase to accommodate it, or do you think it'll fit into the model as it currently kind of exists from a budget point of view?
From my point of view, I think it's likely to remain fairly neutral, to be honest.
Right.
I don't think you're going to make huge savings. You might make marginal savings, but then there are other areas of costs that probably aren't even in the budgets anymore at the moment. So I think that I don't think it will make it massively more expensive, because I don't think everyone will adopt it.
Yeah.
But I also don't think it's going to make it massively cheaper, unfortunately. And as Claire pointed out earlier on, what it may do is make everyone's work-life balance a little bit better.
Yes, and it was interesting. I demoed D to an editor, I think he's based north of Norwich, who's, it's fair to say, like me, getting on. And he was fascinated and entranced by it, but also very regretful, because it meant he'd wasted 20 years of his career that he could have been working from his home in North Norfolk, when he's been commuting into London all these days to do his editing job. So yeah, I think it does offer a transformational opportunity to, as you say, work in ways that we haven't traditionally expected to be able to do so, particularly with the editing of pictures and sound, which is quite until recently been quite tricky to do, apart from on hard drives attached to large computers. Cool. So I think we've reached 11:30. I have to confess, I'm a little bit uncertain as to how we segue out of this. I don't know if I think maybe should we just keep chatting until we get gaffed off or whatever. So I've timed my questions to perfection. So advice to others. Obviously there are different people on different trajectories. So Richard, Dan, you've alluded to the fact that you're quite a long way down the path. Clearly, Claire, you guys are too. I don't think that's universal. And I think, from the questions, the egress fees, all that kind of stuff. I mean, should people fear the Reaper? Is it, any advice as to how you would progress, Claire? What would your kind of, having done it, what would you, looking back, give advice to yourself just before you started?
I think you have to, however long your timeline is, I think you need to extend it. Simply because of the volume of data that you're trying to transfer from one place to another. I think also get your house in order, and it's never too soon to start sorting out, doing a bit of a data cleanse of your, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of files that you have stored, and version 1, version 2, this cut, that cut. It all takes huge amounts of time, and it all costs money. So I think getting to where we are with our systems, it's taken probably about 5 years. And, we have had to spend money. So business as usual, cost associated with that, plus additional cost for getting those assets from our supplier, the cost of the snowball transfer, then of course reaching out to the MAM vendors, choosing that MAM vendor, and then all the development costs associated with that. And then of course you're not only paying storage for what you've uploaded to AWS, you've also paying the storage costs to do business as usual. So it is a big expense, and it's painful, but certainly I think in the long term it's hugely advantageous. So I would say start now, start thinking about it now.
Yeah, I think from a sort of production point of view as well, is that what we spent a lot of time going through and comparing costs between AWS and Azure and all of that, and working out whether 0.000000001p is more expensive or cheaper than 0.0000001p. Probably not realizing actually the total costs are going to end up being not insignificant when you take into account a huge volume of data that you're dealing with. And just as an example, I know Claire's already mentioned one, but we were transitioning 200 and 250 terabytes from one system to another system, and even using the equivalent of a snowball system, it took 3.5 weeks to transfer it from one space to another. So, and actually at the time, I was really impressed with how quick that was, because it's, you know, it's a lot of information to copy across. And to be honest, if you take my word for it, then I can't see a huge amount of difference between the cost for Azure and the cost for AWS. But it's not an easy cost comparison, because there's so many elements built into it that it makes it a difficult and a fairly technical process in order to come up with an accurate costing of how much it's going to cost you.
Fantastic. Thank you. So Claire, Dan, thank you very much for your participation. Apologies for my muted or my lack of audio at the end, but that was fascinating. And thank you very much for the insight into how you guys have transitioned to the cloud, and for, you know, helping everyone understand what potentially, you know, the opportunity, you know, that exists for them too. I'm sure everyone's dipping their toes in, but I think you guys have both jumped in, you know, both feet first, and I'm glad it's working well for you both. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.